she likes to dial 2 or 3 times in a row.
Are you still alive?
No, well, it's because, remember when we had like just the phone in the kitchen or wherever?
Yeah.
She's still in this habit that eventually you'll get to it. Like maybe you're just far away from the phone. I'm just like, homie, my phone is in my pocket. If I didn't answer.
Where does your mom live? Yeah.
She always, she knows I'm going.
Yeah. I always have to call my mom and say, I got there safely. Yeah.
We'll go live in a minute. I'll do an introduction to get warmed up. Geez, everybody's ready. We're live streaming, so we're going to wait till 5. The hush. Those that are in my class, there is a list going around, so if you want to sign it, or you see your classmates, catch them wherever the list is. All right, so 5 p.m., we're ready to go. I'm Matt Garcia. I'm the Richard and Ralph Latherus Chair of Latin American, Latino, and Caribbean Studies, History, and Social Relations. And I'm very happy to moderate this long overdue conversation about our food system. I'm calling it, If Not Immigrants, Who? Food Labor in the Era of Mass Deportation. And we are live streaming, so welcome to those out there. We've had really good experience with our alums in particular. Welcome, alums. And so I'm happy to have this conversation because it's been a cornerstone of my own research, and I'm also a farmer, and I wanted to include part of our Upper Valley farm community. And so this is really a look at the question of how our food system depends on immigrants, both far and near. So according to the United States Department of Agriculture, only about 1/3 of farm workers today are U.S. born, and nearly half are undocumented. And this dependence on immigrant workers at this level is a recent phenomenon, though history shows that immigrants have always been a critical part of the food production system in the United States. In 1991, undocumented farm workers were roughly 14% of the workforce. By 2002, that number had grown to 55% and has remained close to that level since. Among this group of workers, foreign-born people from Mexico and Central America dominate. In recent years, farm workers have become more settled, with fewer pursuing a seasonal follow-the-crops migration that's maybe familiar to you in Steinbeck novels, for example. They're also not as young as they used to be, with most being 30 years or older. And they command better wages today than their predecessors, though often those wages are far less than what is adequate to afford the cost of local housing in the regions where they're employed. I think that's true here in the Upper Valley. Higher wages and more expensive living conditions has also influenced employers' decisions on who to employ: domestic workers, undocumented, and guest workers. Some have, to some degree, automated their crops, meaning that they brought machines in to do a lot of the work. And we see this particularly in dairy. But that automation is really not capable of replacing human labor at a scale that we produce food in this country, though that is a consideration in this conversation today. And with the Trump administration's focus on mass deportation of undocumented and perhaps now documented immigrants, our farm labor workforce and the farms they serve have never been so precarious. Last week, in fact, ICE agents entered a Vermont dairy, apprehended 8 undocumented workers, which Civil Eats, the online journalism site, argues is the first workplace raid on a farm in the United States under Trump's second term. Whether that's true or not, it's definitely alarming. And ICE, for the record, said it was just happenstance that 8 ended up in their custody. They went in after one person. But I think the local media and local farmers are taking this as a real concerning moment. So this panel is designed to answer one simple question and then branch out from that, which is, how will America feed itself without immigrant labor? We've been confronted by this question before, so we have history to draw upon for some answers, and we have a historian, who I'll introduce in a second, who's really focused to this point for her entire career on guest workers. So guest workers is very much something that's represented in the work of a lot of our panelists today. So our panelists have engaged this question from multiple entry points, possessing a variety of objectives. In the spirit of the Dartmouth dialogues, we expect disagreement. But that disagreement doesn't mean that we can't have a civil conversation and that we can't get to the complexities of the current situation that confront workers, employers, and consumers, right? So now, let me introduce our panelist. To my left is Mireya Loza, that historian that I just referenced, Associate Professor of History and American Studies at Georgetown University. Mireya wrote the book, Defiant Braceros, How Migrant Workers Fought for Racial, Sexual, and Political Freedom, that was published in 2016. This is the definitive study, in my opinion, and many other people's opinion, of the most fabled guest worker program in this country, the Bracero program from 1942 to 1964. And it's based on oral histories that she herself collected for the most part. It was part of a larger Bracero oral history archive that's now online. And we collected, I say we because I was part of the genesis of it. I was one of the principal investigators. But it was Mireya who collected the majority, not the majority, but the largest share of the 800 interviews that now have really reshaped, in many ways, guest worker history and Latino history, I'd say. She was also instrumental in helping to launch the Smithsonian exhibit that went with that collection called Bittersweet Harvest, the Bracero program 1942 to 1964, that traveled throughout this country for many years. And I think it even went to Mexico at some point.
Traveled for a decade.
Yeah, for a decade. It was touted as the first Latino-oriented exhibit, and it really surpassed anybody's expectations. I would say it might be the reason why we even have a National Museum of American Latino in the works today. So thank you, Mireya. She also sat on a program or advisory board for the USDA, the United States Department of Agriculture, during the Biden administration. And prior to her position at Georgetown, Mireya held a curatorial position in the National Museum of American History at the Smithsonian Institution. And she was an assistant professor of history at the University of Illinois Urbana-Champaign, her alma mater, where I met her when she was 18 years old.
Yeah.
Teresa Morris, I'm doing this in alphabetical order, is Associate Professor of Anthropology at University of Vermont. Teresa is the author of Life on the Other Border, Farm Workers and Food Justice in Vermont in 2019. And again, the definitive book on agriculture and labor in our neighboring state. It's my state where I live, but Vermont. And really an incredible work that reveals not just the toil of farm workers, but the activism. And she's, to add to that, of course, very important is that she is a member of the executive board for Migrant Justice, which she writes about lovingly in that book, and continues to serve that really important organization. Migrant Justice is a nonprofit labor justice organization that was created that has created the landmark Milk with Dignity program in 2017, covering more than 50 dairy farms in Vermont and New York and more than 250 dairy workers. The program ensures an independent third-party monitor to resolve violations of agreed-upon set labor standards. Teresa is also soon to publish with Laura Ann Minkoff-Zern, Will Work for Food, Labor Across the Food Chain. And that's coming out this year with UC Press. Phil Mason is owner and farmer of Crossroad Farm in Thetford, Vermont. You probably know Crossroad if you venture across the river from Hanover. He also is the person that is responsible for Crossroad Farm Stand in Norwich. Phil has worked at Crossroad Farm in Post Mill, Thetford, Vermont, since he was 14 years old, and worked part-time there until going to college. He graduated from Colby College and then committed his life to agriculture full-time. He managed the farm crew at Crossroads and eventually became a partner in the business with Tim and Janet Taylor in 2017. He became the sole owner of the enterprise in 2022, which includes the farm stands both in Norwich and at Post Mill. And it's a successful seasonal farm stand, which in Norwich just opened this week, right?
Correct.
And Post Mill's still it's about a month away.
Where the farm stand opens in a month, our greenhouses are open as of last Friday. So
Yeah.
both stands open for the season.
So I did business with Phil as a farmer who supplied his farm stands with my grass-fed beef for 2 seasons. But what was really exciting, too, is to discover that we have a common connection through his grandfather. I knew Phil's grandfather and his namesake, Phil Mason Sr., who was the director of the Walter Reuther Library at Wayne State University in Detroit, Michigan, through the second half of the 20th century. Phil Sr. worked closely with Cesar Chavez. He played handball with Cesar in California and convinced Cesar to send all the records for the United Farm Workers to the Reuther Library in Wayne State. And it was that archive that allowed me to write my second book, From the Jaws of Victory. So I was just amazed that we had this interesting connection. Finally, Erik Nicholson is the interim executive director of Semillero de Ideas, a nonprofit organization that centers farm workers as the drivers of innovation in agriculture, and is the founding partner of Pandion Strategy, a consultancy focused on developing worker-centric solutions in agriculture. He has also served as a board member of probably the most famous farm worker union in the country, United Farm Workers, from 2008 to 2020, where he was also national vice president. Much of his work has been based in the Pacific Northwest, a region where he tripled UFW membership. He also served as a founding member of the Equitable Food Initiative that coordinated with Costco, with Driscoll Farms, yes, those berries that are in our markets everywhere, right? And the United Farm Workers to turn farms into a more dignified workplace for farm workers, including guest workers. Nicholson was also a founding member of the farm worker recruiting agency Cierto, a standalone 501c3 organization that promised to remedy abuses in the guest workers program. And we had a really wonderful lunch conversation, and that struggle very much continues to this day. In the years since the creation of Cierto, that organization and Erik's ongoing dedication to justice in the farm worker system contributed to the groundwork for the expansion of many different programs, including the guest worker program, through a piece of legislation called the Farm Workforce Modernization Act in 2021 to 2022 that failed. In spite of that failure, it still continues to be discussed, and we talked about it over lunch, we would not be surprised if some iteration were to come forth in the coming months. And so it's a wonderful opportunity to talk about not just the history, but also what it might look like in the near future. This question of how we maintain our food system as immigrants are being rounded up and deported from this country. So I want to start with a simple question. I want to start with Teresa, because you just finished a book with Loza. And so why is the farm workforce associated with immigrants? And probably more importantly, what are the implications of that association for people that employ farm work, but also the consumer?
Yeah, just a tiny question to start us out, Matt. No problem. So it's really nice to be here. I'm really devastated that we have to be having this conversation, but it's really important that we do. I think one of the things is kind of important to acknowledge is that the immigration has always been forced in some way, right? Whether we're talking about enslavement of people to build plantation economies, to economic migrants who have no choice but to migrate in search of work, that this movement has never been voluntary. And I think that that's always a really important thing to start with. I think that in addition to connecting farm work with immigrants, is also important to think about the racialization of farm work and how it's a very intentional degradation of this work that goes hand in hand with the degradation of the people who are doing that work. So I think that, again, a really big question. I think that there's really important questions of scale that we have to think about, that as small family farms are no longer economically possible because of policies, because of messages to get big or get out. We have to think about how the scale of agriculture that is mostly feeding us now is not possible through family labor arrangements, which are themselves exploitative, right? I'm sure that you exploit your own labor all the time, right? And you work way too hard and for not enough money. So I think that the exploitation piece is really important that we get our minds around, and then also how the scale question then makes it so that we have to find labor from somewhere else. And as agriculture is subsidized in really strange ways, and as the small scale agriculture is not subsidized hardly at all, in general, we have to look for workers who their point of reference is often something else, right? That is either war or chaos in people's home nations, or really, really terrible wages from where they're coming, right? Where farm work in the US is then seen as a viable alternative, again, not by choice. So I think it's a really complicated question. I think it brings up policy considerations. I think it brings up scale questions of agriculture. And I think it brings up, really important thorny ideas of racial capitalism and how, these are racial projects. So small thing to start with. But I think right now, what we're seeing is a very decided link between racial projects and deportation, and also a complete lack of sense about how our food system is maintained.
So in each one of these questions, I'll allow folks to jump in if they want to. I mean, I'll put that invitation out now before we move on. I'm not seeing any takers, so, but we can come back to this question because I think it's a really important kind of foundational question of why immigrants in farm work. But one of the ways that we've seen the idea of migrants attached to farm work is in a formal way in our history, right? I referred to guest worker programs, and the famous one was, of course, the Bracero program. So I want to tap into history a little bit here, Mireya, right? Get us going and talk about what were the stated objectives of the Bracero program, and why did it get canceled? And it had really some infamy, right? So what do we need to remember about that moment? Maybe take some time to just describe what it was, and then why is it important to remember what happened? Yeah.
So, the U.S. enters the war, and there's a sense, and agribusiness is clamoring over what will happen in the fields. And I think, perception is everything that they say. There's a perceived labor shortage because, it goes past the war because perception is everything. These jobs, were low wage, often in deplorable living conditions, unsanitary, and not by people's choice, by design, right? And so in a lot of ways, growers basically figured out how to have their cake and eat it too, which means that they could get the workforce they wanted. They understood that the workforce was going to be quote unquote seasonal, which means that it was highly deportable, retractable, and the consequences to the accidents or illness rate of braceros was irrelevant. Like, that wasn't important. A bracero gets sick on your watch and you're a grower, you say, that's fine. You're lazy, you're a huevón. You get sent back to Mexico. Contract terminated. So in a lot of ways, it allows a whole society not to actually care for a worker because the worker is so highly disposable. But they had learned this lesson during World War I, because during World War I, they did the exact same thing. And at that point, they recruited men, women, and children, and to their dismay, women were having American children in the US. People understood that children were also being recruited as family labor. And by basically the first sort of ag recession right after World War I, growers were like, we're kind of broke. So someone's got to take care of these people and send them back. We no longer want to take responsibility. And this question of they're broke was also always in flux. So they'd also clamor again the very next season to have these workers once more. And so it was really easy for them to utilize basically deportation and repatriation and learn again how to have an erasable workforce. I mean, it leads us directly, at least the first guest worker program, into the Great Depression, where Mexicans are scapegoated for, basically being a weight on the economy. And what we have is this sense that, well, it's good when you need us for labor, but when we are whole people that need other things, housing, food, then we're expendable. And I think it created this perception that Mexicans are always expendable, that we don't have to be integrated into society, that we will forever be outside of society. And so the Bracero program just augmented it by leaps and bounds. And I think what growers also learned during the Bracero program at its height is they learned, well, maybe we don't need the Bracero program each time, because these contractors also know how to bring in undocumented labor. And so you have basically the largest growers, or the largest states that brought in braceros, like California, simultaneously learned during this period how to use and recruit undocumented workers. And I mean, I do think, Dr. Mares is perfectly right on when she comments, these are people's choices in a limited amount of shitty choices. Most people would rather stay home and find prosperity in their own backyard. And I think what we've learned also through the H2 is that much of this shittiness hasn't gone away. By the 1960s, you have a cadre of activists who are committed to bringing the Bracero program down. Ernesto Galarza and others, they're documenting human rights violations. They're saying this is not possible, that this is so atrocious. By 1964, Congress terminates it because of severe human rights violations. They're the same human rights violations that we're seeing in the H2 program. And most people say, well, but that's just the system we're given. We can't do anything about it. And I have to remember and remind folks, like, in the 1960s, lots of people said that to activists that brought down the Bracero program. They said, we can't possibly not have the Bracero program. Yet many people were very committed to documenting this, to writing Congress, to saying this isn't right, that this idea that these people are being held, sometimes against their will, that is un-American. And so, I don't know, I keep thinking about the lessons of the past and hoping that, someone in the audience will be the next Ernesto Galarza. I'm just a student of history. I'm just a historian. And I do think that this is where we need labor organizers and activists to come in with a new radical politic.
And yet, we do have on our panel people that participate in recruiting the H-2A workers and are using H-2A workers. So I'd like to match that historical definition and the problems that it engenders with what we see as the reality of H-2A use today and recruitment today. So this is really the territory of Phil, who has employed for 3 seasons now, about to be 3 seasons, workers coming from Jamaica. And also, Erik, you've been involved with Cierto and beyond that, and are an advocate, really, of an enlightened, humane guest worker program, if that can be achieved. Fair enough? Yeah. Okay, so perhaps we work backwards now, not from the history, but we work back from where we are today. Phil, will you tell us why you chose to employ guest workers? Maybe did you know this history? You probably were at least a little familiar with it. And how has it worked out for you?
Sure. This history has been very informative. Thank you. I can't say that I knew about these programs. I'll tell everyone a little bit about the farm and sort of how we ended up moving toward H-2A workers to supplement our local workforce. So Matt, thank you for the introduction. So I started working at the farm when I was 14, and over the course of 25 years or so, ended up buying it. And it wasn't that easy, but eventually it worked out. And one of the things that I've found in sort of my 10 years or so of managing, managing our workforce, managing our accounts, managing the business, is that it has become harder and harder to find a local workforce to work consistently and meet our needs throughout the growing season. It's complicated. I can't exactly pinpoint it why that is. I think one thing that's sort of unique to our business is that, and also just a testament to the growing season in Vermont and us as a diversified vegetable farm in Vermont, is that our labor needs are very seasonal. So it used to be when the farm was smaller that we were basically our harvest window was in June, July, and August. And we were able to, maybe it's obvious, but we were able to basically hire high school and college age students on their summer break from the academic calendar. And that basically did it for us with a few full-time employees, the owners. But as we've grown the business over the last 10 years, we've really started to engage in season extension, both in the spring and in the fall. And now we're continuing to harvest huge volumes of crops into September, October, and even November, and even now growing greens in high tunnel greenhouses into December. So the synergy with the academic calendar isn't really applicable for us anymore. Our needs are sort of unique in that they're this 6 to 8 month window where we need people to work 40 hours a week. 5 days a week. We don't do anything crazy with 90 hour, 60, 70 hour weeks, nothing like that. We try to keep it to 40 to 45. And we found starting about 5 years ago, that we were unable to meet that need with local labor. So we became familiar with the H-2A program. A lot of farms in New England use H-2A labor. I think it's even more relevant in an orchard dynamic, because now that season you're talking 6 weeks, 8 weeks of harvest, where you might need 30 workers for 8 weeks, and that's it. So good luck trying to find local help for 30 workers to work 8 weeks, and then see you later. Good luck. But please come back if you can next year. That's a tough ask. So we turned to, so 3 years ago we brought in 3 H-2A workers from Jamaica. The program, and I can speak to the program maybe a little further in the conversation, but one of the things that we do, the program stipulates, is that you have to provide housing, so they live on the farm. they live in the same house that the owners of the farm lived in for 30 years, basically. So they're there right on the farm. They're some of the nicest, kindest, diligent, hardworking people I've ever met. They're just absolutely fantastic. And I feel like just in these last few years, I really feel like they've become a part of the farm family, and they love it. I understand the dynamics that are expressed, and that they don't have great alternatives, and they don't. I mean, the minimum wage in Jamaica is $17 a day, and we're paying them $19 an hour. And that wage is required through the adverse effect wage requirement. So to be a part of the program, you have to pay them that wage. And every state is different, and it's a function of what the average agricultural wage is in that state. We still employ local people. Students. We still have a dozen or so students, high school and college students, that work the summer, and we have 5 full-time employees. We have a whole group of part-time folks, semi-retirees, if you will. So it's quite a diverse mix. But the H-2A workers, they really, these gentlemen, they really provide that core, they're so hardworking, and they are here because they really want to work and make money and support their families back home. And that's just been an incredible rock for our workforce these last few years.
Thank you, Phil. So Erik, you belong to the union of Cesar Chavez and Dolores Huerta. I'll always add Gil Padilla was very influential in my writing in my book, so I always name him, but there's plenty of other founders. And those folks were, against the guest worker program. And so we've talked about it offline, but I think for most people, they're a little surprised that the union that was against the farm work, against the guest worker programs, now is one that is saying, okay, we can do it humanely. You were a part of that union. And maybe just talk about your own personal journey to that realization, and then talk about what you're trying to do to kind of achieve some of the humane goals that Phil just outlined.
Yeah, so I think the challenge, I'm 5 years out from the UFW, so my opinions are those of my own, not representing the union, but I often fall back to the we. You're dealt the hand that you're dealt. So when I started organizing farm workers in the Willamette Valley in 1990, the dynamic Mireya described was very alive, where farm supervisors would go back to Mexico, recruit their parents, whomever from Mexico, and then bringing up an undocumented status, and then put them in labor camps throughout the Willamette Valley. The conditions were horrendous. Those workers suffered dire consequences if and when they were found talking to us. I had a worker beaten almost to death the morning after his supervisor found out he had spoken to me, and he had to flee the following day for his life. It was horrendous, and it continues to be horrendous. And during that time, we watched as the last legalization that we had was in the mid-1980s. Believe it or not, President Reagan oversaw that. And those workers started to exit agriculture, and we saw this massive influx of workers that we had never seen before. Many, many indigenous workers from across different regions of Mexico. Veracruz coffee farmers, who their farms are no longer viable because Vietnam had entered the WTO and the price of coffee plummeted. And so we're left in this situation of, we now have this massive influx of undocumented people, and so we did what we know how to do, is we put forward bills in Congress to legalize them, or amnesty, or you pick the word, and they went absolutely nowhere. Democrats, Republicans, equally, nope, we're not going to do that. No reason to address this issue. And in the late 90s, the union was approached by a congressman in Southern California, and at the same time, what was occurring was that the grower community was coming forward and saying, hey, we need to do changes to the guest worker program. We had the power on the advocate side to block that. So what we basically had was a 20-year stalemate, where we were unable to achieve any type of legalization or adjustment status for farm workers, and the grower community was unable to achieve any type of modification of the guest worker program or H-2A visa process. And so Congressman came to the union and said, if this is working for you, all good, But if you actually want to change something, perhaps you guys need to start talking to each other and figure out a deal. Which was extremely uncomfortable, because I can tell you it's far easier being right than being impactful. But when you work for a union, you have to show up to workers and look at them in the face and tell them why or why not, right? And we could take an ideological high ground and say, we're not going to negotiate with the employers because we don't believe in guest worker program. That is the fastest way to, not only as an elected officer, to lose your position but get thrown out of the union, because what workers would tell you, I don't care about your ideology, I need someone to get the boot off my neck tomorrow. And if you can find a vehicle to do it, do it. And that has been the mandate that the membership of not only the UFW, but a flock of Pekun have said, is get the boot off of our neck. And so as a result, we went to Congress, and again, in a number of uncomfortable, and I was part of the most recent negotiations, sat down with the employer community, and 3 times came up with bipartisan bills that we intended to get Congress to pass. So the first was ag jobs in 1999, and then the next one, believe it or not, it was led by Senator Marco Rubio, who was like an amazing advocate for farm workers. I still can't believe I'm saying these words in this current context. And we got the bill through Senate, right? We came very close to getting ag jobs passed during President Bush. And then in the first Trump administration, the industry looked at ourselves like, we're going off the cliff here. We need to come up with a bill that then President Trump will sign. So think about that. That's the context that you have to negotiate. You have a split Congress, a President Trump, and we need to thread the needle to come up with a bill that will actually pass. Because again, symbolic gestures in the farm worker community are meaningless. They need relief immediately. And so we came up with the Farm Workforce Modernization Act. And it is, the growers hate it, we hate it, but it's the best compromise we could come up with that could actually get a president to signing it through Congress. Unfortunately, we were unsuccessful. Got it through the Democratic House repeatedly, and one of, I think, the existential challenges we've seen is the grower community writ large has been unable to deliver the Republican Party in any type of meaningful immigration reform in almost 30 years. And so that bipartisanship has fallen apart. We'll see now what happens. The congressperson where I live in Eastern Washington was one of the co-sponsors. His chief of staff was literally in the room with us when we were negotiating the bill. Congressman Newhouse is making noises like he might reintroduce the bill. But we'll see. But when you look out over the lay of the land of farm workers, it is the most horrendous situation I've experienced in my 35-year career. The trauma, the fear that people are living right now is unprecedented. And as Matt described, we know, and we saw this during the Obama administration, when ICE shows up, they don't care. They look at the color of your skin and they look at what language you're speaking. Vámonos. If you don't have proof of citizenship, which I currently do not have on me, you're off to the detention center, right? And so we have an array of really horrible options in front of us that define some degree of progress. And those are the cards that Phil and I have been dealt with of how do we keep our food system going in light of this, and how do we kind of come up with some modicum of respect and relief for the amazing women and men that feed us.
So that exact experience happened last week in Vermont, right? Where they came onto the farm, 8 people were rounded up, and they're gone, right? And Migrant Justice, which is one of the organizations that's been really adamant about this issue in terms of not supporting guest worker programs. I hate to actually have you, Teresa, speak for them, just as I hate to have you account for UFW, but I think it's worth knowing why organizations like Migrant Justice, like Coalition of Immokalee Workers was, they really weren't for it. There's other organizations, we don't have to run down the list, but let's just stay with Migrant Justice, and maybe from your research, why would certain organizations be against what Erik's talking about, even if it is about delivering the goods, delivering some kind of law that's workable?
Yeah, I think, that's super, super helpful context for this. I think, and again, speaking for myself as a researcher, not on behalf of Migrant Justice, I am a volunteer board member of a very flatly horizontal organization that is farm worker led. So I think from my understanding, it is about sort of using a model that we know to be flawed as a model for, broader regularization and legalization of farm workers, right? And I think that when we see, farm worker activism, it's important to see that it's not a monolith, and there's lots of different strategies, and there's lots of different approaches, and there's lots of different motivations. And from my understanding, farm worker groups who opposed some of the expansion or sort of regularization of H-2A and expansion of it didn't want to use a model that has been proven to have abuses as a model to expand for more farm workers. I think that there was a concern about E-Verify. There was a concern about the impacts that E-Verify would have on undocumented people, making them even more vulnerable, which I think is an understandable concern. And I think it's also, most of my work has been within dairy, and dairy is very different than the seasonal agriculture that we're talking about. And the H-2A program right now only covers seasonal work. And so on the part of dairy workers, there's been a lot of mixed feelings about the H-2A because A, it doesn't right now cover dairy because dairy is not seasonal, and that's an artificial thing, right? But dairy happens year round. And so right now there's no legal pathway into finding work in the dairy industry. H-2A does not apply. So I think that there was a concern about using a model that was really for seasonal ag for year-round workers. I think that those dynamics are very different, and the kind of experiences that workers have in those different kinds of industries can really vary. And I think it is in some part ideological, but also like how do we use something that we know is not working as well as it could to build out. But I think the nuance and the complexity and the really fraught political environment that we're in, does require us to think about, what are all of the potential solutions. I think what I find is interesting is, the work of migrant justice and the CIW has not just looked to policy arenas as places for change. And I think if we look at all of the intentional ways that farm workers are left out of legal protections and policy decisions, we can see that some of the really exciting things that are happening, in my opinion, to bring farm worker rights are not actually happening in policy, right? They're happening as corporate reform, which is a very touchy subject, right? And corporate control in general is something we want to question. But I think it's, to me, an important thing to keep in mind that policy works in some ways, but there's a lot of other options, including reform of the corporate system and the supply chain that is feeding us.
Yeah, and we talked a bit about, you actually said to the panel, I want to talk about worker-driven social responsibility.
Yep.
And I'd like you to maybe define that term.
Yeah. Pull out the glossary. Yeah.
But more to the point is like, what would that actually look like?
Yeah.
Because I think to some extent, and I wonder also, Erik, to what extent do you embrace that, or is if the best deal is what the agricultural lobby says they'll agree to, is that then not corporate-driven social responsibility? I like to think about that tension between who's driving the decisions and the legislation that moves forward, if anything moves forward.
Yeah, and I think it's a both and, right? I don't think it's policy or corporate reform or this. I think it's the right tool for the right project. So worker-driven social responsibility is an approach that attempts to identify power within a supply chain and to put the pressure on the most powerful entity in the supply chain. And the most powerful entity is not the farmer, right? Power in the food system is not benefiting farmers, right? And in general, it's benefiting very large companies, very large corporate buyers, right? And if you look at the wealth flows in our corporate food system, it's to large retail, it's to large fast food, it's to grocery chains, it's not to you, right? And I think what worker-driven social responsibility has done is point to where money is being made and where money can be spent, and putting the pressure on those corporate purchasers to make small, for their standards, small adjustments to their purchasing behavior that then has really large impacts on the farm itself, not at the expense of the farmer, right? And in Vermont, our dairy farms are pretty small, and the farms that are participating in Milk with Dignity are pretty small. They're much smaller than the farms that are participating in the Fair Food Program, which is coordinated by the CIW. And so I think it's a different model that doesn't wait for legislation to catch up and doesn't have to navigate a really fraught political system, but can really leverage consumer interest, which again is fraught, and corporate power for the benefit down the supply chain. So worker-driven social responsibility is used in the food system, it's used in dairy, it's used in produce. Members of Bangladeshi sweatshop organizations are part of this. The newest iteration is an organization called Venceremos, which is a chicken processing organization that is emerging in the South. And so I think to me, it's a really innovative model, and it's not the only model. I think we also need policy reform, but it seems like it is sometimes maybe a bit quicker to take impact than especially federal changes in policy.
So that's that third-party monitoring that I mentioned at the very beginning,
Yep.
which doesn't wait for legislation to happen. And so I'll move on to you guys in a second, but I wanted Erik to just talk about why you continue to hit your head against the federal legislation when there's this other alternative, and maybe is this just not a viable way of approaching the systems that you're dealing with?
I think it's a both and. I
Okay.
mean, if we look at, I think what I would assume to be our collective aspiration to have a dignified food system, it's what I love you all out here in the Northeast have is a wicked problem, right? If we think there's a single solution, we're kidding ourselves, right? I've done a lot of corporate work. Corporations have no say over legal status of workers. Right, so we could get a corporation to say, we want legal workers, that's nice, that's a exclusive federal issue, right?
Yep.
We have done a lot of work, one of the first things the union did was get rid of DDT through collective bargaining agreements. Where I live in the state of Washington, through collective bargaining, we were able to get blood testing called cholinesterase testing, way before we were able to get the state of Washington to do that. So I think the false dichotomy from my side, Matt, it's not one or the other, but if the collective we have this aspiration of creating a more just food system, what are the variety of iterations that we need to have? And I would suggest even more importantly, what are the new iterations we need to have? Because if we think, and 35 years into this, if we think doing the same thing we've been doing, at least for my career, is going to create a different outcome, Einstein calls that insanity, right? So we can keep going, and fingers crossed, we'll figure it out. And just a reality check, right? And collective indictment of the work of my peers and others. If you take the amazing work the Coalition of Immokalee Workers, Fair Food, Migrant Justice, the United Farm Workers Flock, Familias, all of the advocates in their entirety in the United States, let's just say it's about 200 years of collective effort. We've had 6 of our staff and members murdered during that effort. We're maybe 3% of the domestic workforce, or the workforce of the United States. Where this becomes even more absurd is that our food system is international. Over half of the fresh fruits and vegetables we consume in this country come from elsewhere. So I spend a lot of time in Mexico. The berries coming up right now that we're consuming on the West Coast are from Mexico. They're from Jocotepec, Jalisco. They're from San Quintin, Baja. They're from Zamora, Michoacan. Why do the models that we have somehow say, they're in Mexico, we're not going to engage these folks, when they are feeding us as much as the righteous folks in Vermont, California, or wherever they may be, or on your farm, right? So I think we've got a lot of work to do. My angst and anxiety isn't about the perfection or imperfection of the amazing models that we have, because again, maybe 2 or 3% coverage after 200 collective years. How are we going to get to the 97%, and how are we going to get to those amazing women and men that are feeding us around the world? They're in desperate need of relief. And those are the questions I think we really need to hold ourselves accountable for.
So, Mireya, you were an advisor, or you were part of an advisory board for the USDA that also included Arturo Rodriguez, right, former president of UFW. And could you give us like a little insight into what the conversation was like about the Farm Worker Modernization Act?
Yeah. I mean, to start off with, maybe, I mean, what I realized we didn't do is tell you what the act was, right?
Yeah, go ahead.
It's basically has two big parts, right? One part is, and it sounds really great, to modernize farm workers, right? You're all in, right? It's a great title. It's a great name. The first part is basically to provide a legal pathway to undocumented workers. Sounds good? We're all for it? But they'd have to work from anywhere from 4 to 8 years on a farm, which means that they're tethered to a work area, which means they'd have to earn their green card. Earn their green card. What does that sound like to you? It's indentured servitude. It's a modern indentured servitude. I feared when this was proposed that what we know to be true as well is that this becomes the carrot, right? So we know that there's sexual violence in these farms. We know that there's a lot of labor exploitation. If you knew that you were there for years earning your green card, do you think you would report the violence? Probably not. So it places basically people on an even more uneven playing field, at least for me. And then the second part would be to expand the guest worker program, to expand it to a large degree. And I think the problem that I see there is another huge structural problem. We know it doesn't work, but we also, what I know to be true is that anything can be classified as seasonal. So the minute you expand the A category, the B is eventually going to be expanded. And soon enough, we're gonna have someone convince us that, Amazon, fulfilling sites, that they need guest workers, that everything becomes guest worker labor, because anything can be temporary. Everything has a height, right? And we can say, well, at Macy's, they really need cashiers in December. That's when we need guest workers, right? Or we really need, on, say, for instance, a poultry farm. This is the height. We really need people at this point. And so my bigger concern is that, again, that we're unleashing a system that is uneven and that the corporate world is going to take a page from agribusiness, that they are learning lessons from agribusiness. And I don't think this fares well for basically the American worker in general. And now you'll say, well, but, Mireya, Americans don't want to do this work. I actually think that they do. There are problems of seasonality. There are problems, with, all kinds of other situations that are very particular to, say, for instance, small farms. But the vast majority of guest workers go to large farms. They actually don't go to your farm. Mm-hmm. And they actually go and live in trailers. And they don't go and live in a house where you actually get to say, hey, does your heat work? Does the water work? What do you need here? Mm-hmm. And because you're at a smaller scale, you actually get to know people's names. You actually get to check in on them. But most people, they hire folks by large numbers. And they're placed in trailers. And they're placed in deplorable work and spaces with sport conditions and living conditions, often so tight that there is no privacy. So people will makeshift and put up, any kind of sheet. They'd rather not sleep on a sheet because they need it to create a little semblance of humanity and privacy. And they'd rather use it for that. So, I think that the system is already very fraught, and in the USDA, at least one of the things that I found the most troubling is that we think of agriculture as a straight capitalist system, but we prop up through the USDA and through subsidies the system we want to create. So the bigger question is, why are we subsidizing export crops, soy and corn, and not your work, right? So why isn't the USDA committing more to the kinds of diverse and small farmers that are actually doing things that are in a more sustainable way, in a more humane way? And I think, to me, that's part of the bigger issue, right? The people in agribusiness, they're not going to be here, right? They send their lobbyists, and that's who pushes forth these policies. It's not often folks like you saying, hey, we need these kinds of subsidies to feed people better.
And the consumer is aware of this and makes a choice in terms of social responsibility, right? How does their food come to them? How am I contributing to the inhumanity on the farms. And my thought is that people who are making the choice to go to Crossroad farm stand are making not just a choice about the flavor, though it's great, it really is, but they're also making a choice about supporting local agriculture, maybe you in particular. Can you give us just a sense of why you don't compete with the tomatoes that are coming from Mexico? And what are the things that consumers, your customers, tell you why they shop at Crossroad Farm?
Yeah, absolutely. So I think that you've heard the phrase that you want to know where your food comes from, and I think at its most fundamental level, that's why people want to shop at the farm stand. They know the farm, they know me. We send out a weekly newsletter every week to everyone who's signed up for our email list. So there's that interpersonal connection that we have with our customers. And just to speak to a little bit to what's brought up, I mean, I totally acknowledge that Vermont in the Upper Valley is such a unique place, and our farm is so unique, and it is so different than most of the area, most of the farms that we're talking about and referring to. In my experience, the having the H2A workers has been like viewed so positively by our customer base. I mean, they absolutely love it. I mean, they love the diversity that it brings. They love just sort of integrating the different groups with different cultures into the broader food system. And I think it's so unfortunate that there are these abuses on such a large scale, because I think that in Vermont at a small scale, my experience is it does work. It has worked. And I don't just speak for Crossroad Farm, but other area farms. And I will just add that I would describe it as relatively heavily regulated, at least in Vermont. I would just like to speak to the fact that our housing is inspected by the Department of Agriculture. It needs to meet fire code for rental housing. So basically it needs to check every box that it would if you were to be a landlord, which I think is a relatively high standard. But again, that's just in Vermont. So I don't know if to what degree, as we talk about these solutions, if the state, has a role to play, because I mean, at least, here, that's where, that's who's mandating those, regulations, at least with respect to the fire safety code in particular. So.
And one of the things you do that makes it much more palatable, and in fact, the community can endorse, is that every time you have a celebration with those guest workers, I've never seen you not invite the wider community, right? So it's very transparent. And I think that there's quite a bit of variety when we think about it across the United States, as Mireya is testifying. I'd like you to maybe talk about why automation, or as people think of machines,
Sure.
could replace this work, because sometimes that's also a thought. If mass deportation takes away the immigrants, well, we'll just automate everything and make machines do it. Why is that not a viable option?
Yeah. So again, our farm being so diverse, it's hard to make that investment in a piece of machinery, that might cost $500,000. If there's a sweet corn harvester that's $500,000, well, we're only growing 2 acres of sweet corn, so the payback on that is not going to work out for us. And we're growing close to 200, varieties of 50 crops. Each one might take its own unique way to harvest or to cultivate. And what's more, we're so fortunate in that so much of our market is, so much of our produce is being sold directly to the consumer, basically within 24 to 48 hours of harvesting, that there's that, and our customers recognize that, and we want things fresh, and oftentimes that just doesn't work that well with mechanical harvesting and mechanization in general. I mean, we want to harvest that sweet corn or, pick those tomatoes when they are ripe, when they're ready to go, not when, the equipment is free and, we throw them in the barn for a week and wait for everyone to buy them. The last thing I'll bring up too is it just, I want to circle back to sort of how I grew up on the farm. And, I really think that, manual labor has been, it's hard, but it's been such an important thing for me and sort of my development. And I think that, while we do employ these H-2A workers, we still hire high school workers. And frankly, I don't think if there was that perfect piece of equipment, even if it was affordable and it harvested everything, I don't think I'd want it. Because I think that it's such an amazing, such an amazing work, to just get out there on your hands and knees in the sun. And, we've had hundreds of high school students, in local schools that have come and started work when they're 15 and 16, and they try to hack it and they limp to their car at the end of the day because they're so tired. And, they come back and visit in college and they say, this was the best thing I ever did. It was just the best. I worked my butt off. My head hit the pillow and I was tired. I fell asleep. And it's a really important thing for me and our business. So.
We're getting to the midway point, and I do want to open it up for questions. So I'm going to just have one more question, then you should be thinking about questions you have. Paula has the microphone. We'll put in a microphone because we're live casting.
Matt, can I hop in on this one?
Yeah, I was just going to go to you, Eric. Go
Yes,
ahead.
so I'd say, from my perspective, the guest worker issue is done. During Obama, it doubled in use. And there's collective effort of amazing people, 50 years trying to somehow stop it, reduce it, and it didn't work. And I was part of that effort. So again, Einstein's definition of insanity, right? We can continue our righteous quest against it. Hasn't worked for 40 years. What are we going to do different? Not quite sure. So the next question is, what's next, right?
Yeah.
I would actually say that for me, what keeps me up at night, especially in the West Coast context, is the very real threat of the ethnic cleansing of farm worker communities across rural America because of the deployment of ag tech. And I'm not being speculative, or this isn't hyperbole. If you read the material of the startup companies that are heavily funded by equity capital, venture capital, this is the future they describe. A food system without workers. This is the aspirational state that they are trying to achieve. And they are getting hundreds of millions of dollars in our taxpayer money going through public institutions intentionally to get rid of farm workers and replace them with fill in the blank. If it's drones, robots, autonomous vehicles, you name it, there is massive amounts of money being invested there. And there are billions of dollars in equity capital going into achieving this goal. And if you read what they talk about, it's not about increasing the integrity of our food system. It's not about reducing food safety outbreaks. From their perspective, it's about becoming the next unicorn, right? And a unicorn is $1 billion grossing entity because they want to cash out and they see agriculture, as they say, is ripe for disruption, right? So where I go back to kind of where I started about what keeps me up at night and an increasing number of farm workers, last year was the first year that we saw widespread deployment of autonomous equipment in agriculture up and down the West Coast. And it was the first time I didn't drive off the side of the road when I saw it, right? So then the next question is, what do we do about it, right? And I think that is still a largely unresolved issue and of concern to many, and I talk to people up and down the supply chain on a daily basis, is the issue of data. And this is what I really want to highlight here, is our food system is under siege. And the equity capital, venture capital people are really smart, and the degree to which they are deploying a robotic apple harvester, as they're trying, there's 10 companies around the world trying to do that in Washington State where I live. If we think about it's harvesting apples, then we really think Facebook is about connecting friends and family. It's about harvesting data. And the race is on. Syngenta, Microsoft, Google, Amazon, Yamaha, they're all out in the fields, all trying to figure out who is going to be the dominant platform, think Uber or Lyft, that is going to be able to aggregate the most amount of data and thus have control over our food system. We've seen this before in the Midwest with mechanization. We've seen this in California with mechanization, with the deployment of a mechanical tomato harvester that UC Davis played an active role in developing. 88% of tomato farms went out of business. 30,000 farm workers lost their jobs because that mechanical harvester was optimized at scale. It was not optimized at a farm of Phil's size. So a neighbor down the street that maybe has 100 acres of tomatoes is going to be much more efficient and cost effective and offering a lower price point to consumers than what Phil's going to be able to do. We're doing this with technology. So I am very, very concerned about the threat of mass deportation. The last thing I'll say on this is that we've done studies in Washington State where Washington State University has been active, for example, in developing a robotic pruner for the tree fruits. And tree fruit is like everything in Washington State. What folks had not considered is that pruning is the only economic activity available to farm workers in the winter. They are not eligible for any type of social assistance because the statistics that Matt referred to, way too low in terms of the number of undocumented people on the West Coast. So if they're unable to prune, they have no ability to feed themselves or their families during the winter months, and they're not migrants. We actually don't use that term on the West Coast. The jobs are seasonal, the workers are year-round. So how are they going to feed themselves? If and when a robotic apple harvester is deployed, apple picking constitutes $7,000 to $9,000 of a farm worker's annual income of $32,000 to $34,000 in the state of Washington. You remove $7,000 to $9,000 from that annual wage, it's game over. And again, we've done interviews with workers documenting this. So the technologists are not even thinking about this, that when they remove a task because they're automating it, those same workers, they're right now cutting asparagus. Then they're going to go into wine grapes. Then they're going to go into blueberries. Then they're going to go into hops. Maybe they're going to go into dairy. It's the same workforce. But if you remove that task, it could be game over for those workers, game over for their ability to remain viable in our state, and we'll have a mass exodus of people out of rural communities, and then what's going to happen to those communities? We're not having a conversation about this, and it is on the verge of happening with bipartisan support. So we've got a lot of work to do to figure that one out. So, just saying.
That wasn't exactly the question I was going to ask, but it was it rhymed with it. Because the other option, and then we'll open up for questions, is what's stopping those that control our food system mining Mexico and exporting the jobs to farms there? We've already seen in 2016, Los Angeles Times revealed that there was massive slavery in Mexico.
Rich Morosi.
The tomatoes that you referred to.
Yeah.
And we see also the massive growth of the avocado industry and the cartels now being involved in that. So what's stopping the system from not going the expensive route of machines, but just going to Mexico and mining it like it's mined things in the past, like gold and copper and what is
they
done
already
in
are.
Mexico?
I mean, and I think this is the other dynamic, is that we have 5 retail brands in the United States that account for over 50% of all the fresh produce that we consume. So if you're Phil, and you go to, my West Coast point of reference, if you go to Aldi, if you go to, I don't know if HEB's up here, and say, hey, I got produce for you, and it's like, great, we've got 1,000 stores. And if you can supply 1,000 stores, 365, you're in. And if you can't, we're not interested in talking to you. So pretty much any grower in the West Coast that is bigger than Phil's operation has to look for some type of viable outlet to sell the volume of produce they're selling. And so by definition, what is now happening, because these markets control the overwhelming majority of the food that we consume, if you are not somehow already growing in other geographies to have a 365 year-round supply, you're out. You're out. And they've been out now for probably 5 or 10 years. And now with these dynamics, that's only accelerating.
Anybody else want to take a shot of any of this, or should we just?
I mean, I could not agree more. I mean, I think we are living in a very complex global world where our food is intertwined with all these other national systems in other places. And I think the frustration definitely is that, you know, if they can't grow it here, they will grow it in Mexico. And our appetite shapes the landscape of agriculture in Mexico, whether that is our love for frickin' avocados or tomatoes, whatever it is. And, we don't, we have this like sort of like local is good. But very few of us are like, local means no avocados here. That means that while you're here in this geography, that is not local. And so I think many of us have gotten to start thinking about our own diets and prioritizing our likes and our needs in our own diets, whether that is, that smoothie that we want during January with berries that are not in season, or the avocado that we want so badly. And I don't think that there's enough sort of consciousness of the fact that, this is really disrupting other people's human rights.
Let's open it up for questions. And please introduce yourself.
Hello. Is it on? Hi, everyone. My name is Rian Gonzalez, and I want to thank all of the panelists for being here today and sharing their knowledge with us. My question is for Phil, and it's kind of loaded with a lot of questions within it, so pick and choose as you like. But as it was pointed out on the panel, you are not what we typically envision as an employer of H-2A workers, and I'm very curious about your process of acquiring H-2A workers, and also you mentioned that they live in the house, and if it is always the same workers that come back every season, and if you know about what they're doing in the off season, and also you mentioned their priority are their families, and if you know about how this work here impacts their families back home.
Great questions. Yes, so it's been the three same workers the whole time we've been involved with the H-2A program. I think Matt referenced it, or someone referenced it, but they're Sedley, Tamar, and Desmond. Sedley's 61, Desmond's 51, and Tamar's 41. So Sedley harvested sugarcane in Florida in the 80s. And has been basically, harvesting crops in the United States for, let's see, where are we? Yeah, 40 years now, anyway. So in relative to that, so in most of the other farms that I'm aware of in this area, it is the same workers. There's a corn and pumpkin farm in Windsor, that I believe has a 75-year-old Jamaican man working there who's been there for 30 years, I think. And again, I can only speak to what I've seen and what I've experienced. Tamar, the youngest worker, who's 42, he has a 4-year-old son that he's very anxious to support, who's just going in school. A lot of it is just trying to send money home to support their families. One of the things that we do, on a weekly basis is, every Friday or within a few days of payday, we go to Walmart in West Lebanon so that they can wire transfer money home, via. I didn't know about any of this stuff, but what are the apps? The Western Union or MoneyGram. And that is like the moment they get paid, that is all they care about doing. And, we support them in that, completely. I think I touched, what else was there?
Off season.
Oh, what they do in the off season, yeah. So one of the things, I know, so for one thing, I don't think they work that much. That's been my experience. I know one of the gentlemen that works with us, he has a skilled trade in Jamaica. He's a tiler, so he has a tile business there, and they definitely have, the other two gentlemen have farms, so they're sort of, I wouldn't call them subsistence farmers, but they grow for their for their families and for their neighbors, and if they have a good year, they can sell it to, they can sell 100 bushels of tomatoes or Irish potatoes, they call them, to the grocery store. But we've discussed, I think Desmond told me, in a good year he'll make $5,000 from his farm, in 6 months or so, based on what he's selling in Jamaica.
So in the past, Phil came to me to source a live goat for Jamaican Independence Day, which they celebrate on the farm. And so this year we're going to partner, and Dartmouth will support a celebration of the guest workers that come here every single year, and we're going to invite them from other farms as well. And we're thinking that make it a big bash with some music and with some food and maybe a goat. And so if you're here in the summertime, then look out for that. So, and we're going to probably have a little intellectual side of it with a lecture and some people that have basically done this historical work of guest workers coming from Jamaica in particular for now decades, actually, in New England. Just a FYI. Another question.
I'm fascinated. Is this even working?
Yeah.
Okay.
And
It's
it's
so
mostly
faint.
for the
It's
live
so
stream.
faint.
So.
I'm fascinated by your comment at the end about the autonomous devices, and also it seems like this is an area that higher education is really at the core of in terms of research and development, and so I'm wondering if you could just talk more about that, and what is the role of higher education? What should it be? What are the ethics involved? That type of thing.
Wow. So just to give you some context, I didn't know this, but under the Biden administration, there were 5 consortia of universities that represent 44 different states across the United States that each received $20 million to figure out how to deploy AI in ag. And that's what we call commodity ag, that's soy, wheat, and corn, and then specialty crops with fruits, vegetables, and nuts. Didn't know this was going on until we saw some of the work that Washington State was doing. They were one of the lead organizations in specialty crop. And we actually engaged them. I have my Semillero de Ideas hat on, the Nursery of Ideas hat on now. Just saying, hey, we've got some concerns about where you guys are going with this, and got nowhere. And then circled back and was able to attend a convening by circumstance where I was invited to speak to the gathering of this consortia at the National Science Foundation in DC. And it was quite anxiety writing because of all these people with letters after the names, which I don't have, and all talking about very proudly how they're getting rid of farm workers and automating ag. And the night before I didn't sleep, right? And I talked to the co-founder Semillero, a longtime friend, Josefina, and was like, what do we do here? And she gave me great counsel. And so what I said to them would be what I would share here, is that in my experience, farm workers have sacrificed every bit of their being so their kids never, ever have to go to the fields. And if ever that's an indictment of our food system, I don't know what else there is, right? And I know many farm workers who are tremendously proud because of their sacrifice that their children have been able to attend many of the universities that were actually in the room at the National Science Foundation. And so my point to them was, now imagine their pain when they realize that these very institutions where their sons and daughters are studying are actively working to eliminate their jobs, right? Farm workers are not asking to be eliminated. We're not saving people from agricultural work by automating. So what farm workers want is a collaboration, a partnership. Who knows better than what needs to happen in the fields to improve things than farm workers? So let's center farm workers as the drivers of what need to happen, bring this amazing technology that folks have in the universities and work together to create a better food system. And we're actually now in that space with folks at both Washington State and Oregon State. And that's our aspiration of let's drive the innovation in agriculture in a way that actually enhances the dignity of work and the ability of producers to remain competitive in this crazy market.
Yeah, and I'll add to that as someone who has theoretically a grant pending with the National Science Foundation to study the impacts of automation. which will not be reviewed in this current federal climate, is I think that there's both the sort of the university investment in developing these technologies that are likely to put farm workers out of work, and then I think there's sort of critical thinkers in science and technology studies that are trying to think about how is automation serving corporate interests once again, right? And concentrating power once again. And there's a lot of scholars, Michael Carolyn, Alistair Isles, that are trying to think about the critical power dynamics there. In dairy, automation is a big elephant in the room. And it's, in Vermont, it doesn't make a lot of sense. In New Hampshire, it doesn't make a lot of sense given the scale, but it is making a lot of sense in places like Wisconsin and California and even Colorado. And so I'm working on a project with some colleagues at Wisconsin and Rhode Island to study sort of what AMS in particular will do to farm worker realities. Whether that is going to go ahead is a huge question mark right now. Automated milking systems. So it's these weird robots that cows walk into and get milked by a robot. They're very, Brave New World-ish.
We have some questions over here.
Hi, I have a question for Phil. So historically, people have greatly underestimated the long-term pace of technological growth. And I was wondering if it comes to the fact that you must replace your workers with automation in order to make yourself profitable, what choices would you make and how would you go about it?
And who's your favorite child?
That's a tough question. I don't know if I can answer that. Which of the? Do you mind just repeating the last part of it? So which?
Sorry.
What was the your last sentence there?
Like, if it comes to the point that you must use automation, or else you won't have a competitive product anymore, what will you choose to do with your farm?
Got it. That's a really hard thing to think about. Again, it's hard to imagine that just given the climate here and just given how the scale that we're at here in Vermont and I'm thinking of trying to contextualize that a lot and why Vermont seems to be different. I think that land use law and regulation is so important and has had such an integral part of why Vermont in particular looks the way it does. And there just simply aren't that many big farms in Vermont. So in the fact that we sell everything directly to consumer makes it hard to imagine how that would happen. But I'd start with things like there's work that is really hard. Picking strawberries, for example. That's really hard. You're you're picking a crop that's at your feet. You have to do it first thing in the morning. It's physically demanding. So I would start with technologies that would remove the most physically demanding parts of the job, first.
Can I add to that?
Yeah.
Because in Washington State, I don't know of a single grower who's like, woohoo, technology's here. I don't know anybody. The replanting costs of an orchard, $50,000 to $80,000 to go from what you would consider a normal apple tree to a two-dimension plane tree that's highly trellised. That's capital intensive. People are tapped out right now. They don't have access to capital. So we're seeing an unprecedented transfer of family farms to equity capital, right off the bat. And the growers I've talked to about this who are deploying robots, who are deploying autonomous tractors, they're very frank. They said, look, I don't want to do this. I don't have access to another $500,000 or $1.5 million or $2 million to buy this stuff. But if I don't figure this out, and my neighbor does, I'm out of business, and under my watch, the family farm's going to go under. Right? And this is the same dynamic we saw in the Midwest with mechanization. Farmers committed suicide when they lost the family farm because they could not afford the new greatest harvester, right? So the choice ultimately will be, and this is by design, either deploy the technology or lose your farm.
I think the harder thing there too is deploy the technology, get in debt, and hope you can pay it off.
There you go.
Because I think that, I mean, you're hitting the nail on the head because this is all capital intensive. And so what ends up happening is that you have to create basically these larger pools of resources just for inputs alone. And that is not, that's not sustainable. That's the problem.
Thank you all. This has been a really interesting conversation. I'm in one of Matt's classes right now, and so getting even more context has been really wonderful. It's been interesting getting to hear about the contrast between a state like Vermont, where you have primarily small farms, and you see examples where the guest worker program is functioning more of like a win, compared with places like California, where you have super large-scale farms where you see a lot more exploitation and abuse. And so I'm wondering, on the one hand, like, what your all thoughts are on whether you can have a just guest worker program that's free of exploitation at scale, if that's even possible, because it seems like that's kind of a key piece here. And secondly, what role do consumers play in providing some of that pressure to achieve a more just employment of migrant workers?
It's scale and desire. So, you know, here we're talking about Phil, he knows his workers. But even in some small scale farms, when employers want to squeeze the 50 hours, when they want to squeeze uncompensated time, when they don't want to fix a heater, when they don't want to do this stuff, the problem I see is that there's no consequences for them. One would say, well, there's inspections that happen before people get there, and there's no inspection during for someone to come in and say, are you holding your end of the bargain? So I think part of it is, you know, it can't be left up to the employer. Like, where do we say, let's hope you have a nice guy. Let's hope you have a nice person as an employer. And why is it that we have to basically hinge it on a good employer? Like, it shouldn't be. It shouldn't be out of the goodness of an employer's heart. And the problem is the Department of Labor, the Department of Ag, they're all stretched too thin. And as this grows bigger, they can check at the beginning of the season, but there's going to be no subsequent checks. And most of the large-scale farms, you and I can't roll up in there. They don't want people like you and I looking at what the conditions are. They literally don't want us there because they don't want people from the outside to know what's going on. So a lot of folks feel, in a lot of ways, held hostage. You know, they're using their WhatsApp to communicate to family members. They don't say anything, even if the Department of Labor does roll in. Why? Because they don't want to get blacklisted. The very next year, you will be blacklisted and you will not be allowed to come back. So I think part of what I see ultimately is that by design, it's designed to deliver the most vulnerable, docile workforce. By design. So how, for me, and I understand, so we were talking earlier, I'm a historian, I'm an academic. I do have lofty goals, but I think part of my idealism is partly because I have family that has gotten H-2 contracts. I've had family that are braceros. And more I'm convinced that if you don't want a job for your own kids, don't design it for my family. If you can't see your own children working those jobs, don't design it for my people.
Yeah, and I think, you know, just to add to that, this is under normal conditions, not when the USDA is being decimated.
Yes,
right? And
which is going to be
when
less so
the
now.
DOL is being decimated. I think that it's a very scary time that these already weakened regulations and inspections are even likelier to not be happening at all.
I mean, the truth of the matter is they skirt around it, right? So, you know, these conditions are supposed to have a certain amount of people, but they figure out after they're inspected how to cram in more people. They also don't really take into account things like the pandemic, where people in trailers, they put sick people outside of the trailer to get better. Why? Because they did not want to catch COVID. And while the rest of us might be working or happily in our homes afraid, these people were still asked to deliver every day for us. And Mexico was literally also receiving bodies, you know? So I don't know. I'm just not that convinced that this is going to work out. And I guess I'm more so convinced about the grim future. And that's what hurts me more. It's like kind of being able to see the past and know what's going to happen next and know how bad it is now, and it's just going to get worse.
Yeah, thank you guys. It's been really super interesting. A lot of thoughts and then like a question vaguely, I don't know, I'll get there. But I've been thinking a lot about, I think, this combination of both exploitation of farm workers happening over the past many decades, and also like the dual exploitation of the American farmer, the decimation of rural communities across this country. I mean, and it's something that, you know, Vermont is, I think, unique in some ways, but not immune from any of these dynamics for sure. I mean, we're losing farms every year in Vermont, and New Hampshire, where I live as well, same thing. But I think maybe if it would be interesting to kind of think maybe a little bit about like a different kind of future, what that would look like. If we think about who has the skills to farm, if not like local workers, if it's workers from other countries, that means communities are going to change, are going to look very different. If we want to revitalize agriculture in the U.S. and globally, that means that communities are going to have to be revitalized. Rural communities are going to have to revitalize. That's going to entail incredible change culturally, demographically, linguistically, all of these things. And so I'd be curious to hear, you know, your thoughts on what a different kind of future could look like, what these communities could look like, and then, you know, along those lines, like how do you do that in a way that avoids some of these like really terrible, like xenophobic, racist sort of responses that I think have been, you know, so much a part of the discourse in the past, you know, I mean, forever, but specifically, you know, in the Trump era. So, yeah.
I mean, from the get-go, I will say, you know, people have been talking about American farmers aging out, American farmers needing new young American farmers. And the truth is that I had a great conversation at one point when I met someone from the New American Farmers Org and other folks, and this undocumented person who said, I don't believe in this cause. He said, we should be the new American farmer. He's like, we know this land, we know this. And folks have already written this. There's a great book called New American Farmer. But they have said this, and you've said it. They know the solutions to these problems. Even if it is on a small scale, they can extrapolate on a large scale. And we keep looking for this kind of white knight to come in, and they actually have solutions. So, you know, on this, you know, Equity Commission and in other work, I ask myself, what are we doing to empower farm workers to become farmers? And the truth is it's not going to happen because it's a lofty goal. But the other is that it also requires us valuing small farms and valuing farms that don't need high inputs and have great outputs.
I think you asked the right question, and one of my, I think, enduring frustrations is that to the degree to which there is movement in the agricultural industry, either on the advocate or the employer side, my experience has been it's been in reaction to something we don't like, right? And it's righteous, and we've reacted to a number of things, that injustices. What I think as an industry we have yet to articulate is the very question you put forward. So what do we want? What is our aspirational state, right? And I'm not a fan of buy local. I know a lot of local growers I will never, ever patronize because I know who they are, right? There's an amazing grower in Mexico. I would love, and every opportunity when I'm in the supermarket, I buy their stuff. I've been on the farm. They're doing some of the most amazing environmental labor stuff I've seen in the Western Hemisphere, right? So I think for me personally, it's a personal decision. I'm not trying to say right or wrong here. It's how, if our system is de facto global, our retailers are global, the workers are international, our food supply is global, our mentality is regional or national. How do we embrace that these workers, wherever they may be, are important because they are feeding our families? What do they deserve? How do we stand righteously with the growers that are employing them and aspiring to treat them in a respectful way? And how do we make sure the infrastructure is there, the equity is there in terms of purchase orders, in terms of policy to affirm them and not punish them, and make sure that the bottom feeders are held into account or their land is put into housing development, right? I think that is the aspirational conversation we have yet to achieve as an industry that I believe we're in desperate need of.
Hi, thank you. My name is Matthew Bassan. I'm a IND or neuroscience PhD student here at Dartmouth. And my question right now has just been like, how are you, Mireya, reconciling this idea of like a carrot being waved in front of a worker's or like a picker's face for like a green card versus like the reality of it being a dead-end job? Like even in a positive H2A setting, there's nowhere to climb. And a lot of these workers, I would imagine even in small farms, don't have like dental insurance, and you can like look at their teeth and their teeth are bad and they can't support like healthcare for their child back home despite sending money home. Like $19 sounds like a lot, but if I can push back, it's like that's all it is. Like at $19 to send back home and like a house for them to work at, it's not like there's nothing to then move up towards. Like that's the limit right there. You can't go back to school. And in like farms that my family's from, Uvalde, Texas, where my entire family worked at, these like really exploitative farms, it's like you would never want your child to do that, right? You would never want your child to like go back to that farm because you know there's nowhere up from that. So I'm so curious, like what's the solution? You don't want it to be this like, we're promising you something, but without a promise, like you know what it is, which is dead end. I'm curious what your thoughts are.
I mean, I honestly think that in the best world, I would love the USDA to actually subsidize the actual foods we eat so that small farmers don't feel this crunch, right? I would love to see the Department of Labor actually have enough boots on the ground to actually do something. I would love to see more of the cases that have gone basically on the record, about basically human rights, cases of modern day slavery basically cropping up because of the H2 system. I would love to see basically a structural commitment, that our government should have. Like, why can't we protect farm workers when we are a nation of rules and laws? Not at the moment, but I mean, like, who we were, maybe. Like, maybe. But, why can't we? Why can't we have more oversight? And why can't we actually do that? Why can't we confiscate the land of people who practice modern day slavery? Why can't we do that?
So there's an effort on the West Coast right now that I've been part of redefining what is agricultural work. And we're actually kind of getting away from actually the term farm worker to talk about agricultural professional. And it's an aspirational statement, but I think a profound one nonetheless, because if you think about a professional, you think about a pilot or a doctor, there's a whole skill set that goes behind that, right? And people who've never done agricultural work wrongly assume that there are no skills involved in doing ag. I like to say I'm exhibit A, right? You put me in the field, I am going to mess it up, the quality's gonna be horrible, and I'm probably gonna file a workers' comp claim within the first 5 minutes, right? So what has been happening how can we, through the engagement of farm workers, document the actual skills that are required, and then build the competencies out, and then do a multi-employer approach so that those workers that have the competencies, when you become an MD, you have a variety of places where you can work. Well, shoot, if I am a competent pruner or whatever, and Phil's looking for help, he's not waiting for Yahoo Erik. He knows that I've got those skill sets, and we start building a career lattice, right? That's multi-employer, multi-commodity, that facilitates workers wherever the geography might be, if it's Jamaica, Vermont, doesn't matter, that they can then deploy those skills and start building the integrity of our system. So it's a design issue as well.
My name is Francisco. Call me Paco. Hi. I like to be here. Well, I have a comment. We feel so proud to work with the community, for the state, for the country. I am a farmer worker. So my question is someone suffer, like they are abused, the farmer is abusing for them, how we can apply a complaint, how we can present a complaint, because we need to trust in the authority. If someone suffers something, they can go with the police, do something. But how? Exists some place, exists a website, something.
We've been on Zoom calls together before. Nice to see you. I think here, there are a number of organizations that have mechanisms, especially within dairy, for those complaints to have an avenue, right? And Migrant Justice has a hotline. The Milk with Dignity program, when it covers farms, there's built-in sort of grievance mechanisms that people can file if there are concerns or violations of the code of conduct. I think that also requires a functioning local Department of Labor and a lack of fear to make that call to begin with, right? And I think that that's what Mireya has been pointing to, is that, all of these things are often keeping people in these vulnerable positions, or a feeling that if I raise this issue, I will be deported, or if I raise this issue, I will be blacklisted. And I know that within dairy, there's a number of mechanisms in the Northeast to make those complaints, and hopefully to make them to players that will have the workers back, and I think that that's hopeful. But how that actually then turns into reform on the farm is a whole other matter, right? Yeah.
Hello. Yeah. Thank you. Thank you all so much for your insights. One thing I was just curious about was the potential for some of these immigrant or undocumented farm workers, because of like the nature of the farming that they're doing in their home countries, to potentially introduce more sustainable, like alternative methods of farming, in the farms they're working on in the U.S. And I know that's obviously not really a possibility for when they're working on large scale farms, but I was just curious, Phil, in terms of your experience, whether the H-2A workers you've recruited have sort of introduced you to new techniques for farming, and sort of just a question of sustainable techniques, and the techniques that they're bringing from their home countries, and how they're sort of adapting those to this new context.
Great question. Definitely. I mean, the guest workers from Jamaica, they grow. I mean, it was a surprise to me, given the difference in climate, that we would grow any of the same crops. But it's amazing how, and again, our farm's small, and we do things a lot by hand. But they grow sweet potatoes the same exact way that we grow sweet potatoes. And I'll ask them, what do you think? What do you think of this plant? You think it's, should we wait a week? Should we plant it now? And their feedback is amazing. And we really do use it. And just a couple, apropos that, I think that what you mentioned is so fantastic. And that's one of the things that I can't wrap my head around it, just thinking of this kind of work as unskilled work. I mean, it's not unskilled work. I mean, it takes the most skill. And I really do think a fundamental reframing of it, and whether it's in education or the community level, but just thinking of these jobs, farm work as work that is revered, and not just a job that you try to get anyone to do, no matter what you can do. You're just trying to get someone to pick this stuff because you got to pick it. No, I mean, this is some of the most important work in the world. Picking food that we need to survive. And I'd be proud as heck to have either my son or my daughter, take over the farm, pick everything on the farm. And one of the things we always say, our managers, is that we never ask anyone to do anything we haven't done ourselves. So literally, we're all working together, on our farm. I mean, there's barely any hierarchy on the jobs, to be honest. I hope that answers your question. But I would love, I think that relative to the legislation that didn't pass, I know it's complicated, but boy, I really wish there was a way that these guest worker programs weren't necessarily temporary. I mean, I really wish that there was a way that we could entertain and consider, having, particularly the gentlemen that have helped us, stay in a more, permanent capacity if they wanted to. I mean, they'd be so valuable. I mean, I truly would love that. And then we'd be able to really integrate those skills and those growing techniques and cultural practices in the fields.
Sticking on this idea of farming as professional, very much skilled labor in like the greatest meaning of the word. I'm curious if you could talk a little bit, Phil, about like just in terms of like training and the amount of effort it takes with these guest workers versus like a high school you're hiring. And this is not to rag on like Vermont high schoolers, but just like from like a professional development capacity, like that's
Yeah.
important skills to learn, but like that is a very different employee to hire. Someone who has like done farm work before versus someone who's like they got the summer off and they don't want to work at the pool or whatever.
You're teeing that one up for me. I mean, that one, it couldn't be, I mean, I can't describe it in more kind of hyperbolic terms. I mean, it's, the guest workers that we've had are just absolute professionals. I mean, they really are. They know the crops. They know, it's just a little thing like you're out in the field and you need to intuit where the tractor tire went, which is the walking path, and where the crop row is. And you get someone out there that doesn't know, and they're just stomping through the crop row, making a mess. And these guest workers, they would never do that. They know exactly where to go from the first second. Harvesting stuff the right way, taking care, working to be efficient, taking care of the crop, being safe, around like tools and knives. Because I mean, it's relative. I mean, there at times we're using some hand tools to clean things up, and they are just, the individuals we've had they are absolute professionals when it comes to diversified agricultural production.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, in my class the other day, so I'm teaching a really large class at UVM, 180 students, and I asked, who wants to be a farmer in this room? We're doing a lot of food-related content. 2 people raised their hands, right? And I think that there's such an important reevaluation that we need to have happen. And also, the incentive to do that kind of work, because we do need those high school students to have that aspiration, but probably being taught by the professionals that way.
A follow-up question, if I can. How do you make that case to like a young person in the U.S. when farming is, I mean, to make it work is so hard, and it's only getting harder every year? I mean, I work with many people who, I mean, me myself, like I'm trying to get into farming. I work with people who are all trying to get into farming, and none of us can like afford it. Land access is a huge issue.
Yep.
Margins are really narrow unless we want to be saddled with an egregious amount of debt that we will never pay off. How do you make the case to like a young person, whether they're from another country or from the U.S., that like farming is important work, it's valuable work, and that you should do it. You should go into farming.
You had the moment.
I don't know. I was waiting to see that. It is hard. I mean, I think that I think it's interesting because one of the things that I don't know. I'm not sure of the statistic, but I think that Americans, for a westernized country, spend the least percentage of their disposable income on food. So I think that like if that's your starting place, it's so hard. And I think that just trying to break down, and I know, I understand the buy local is complicated and kind of loaded, and that we are in a global food system. But I really think, to just push back on that a little bit, I really think that, people that are, if you're buying berries, you're the average consumer and you're buying berries in December, you don't know where those berries are coming from. I mean, you're kind of, well, you know where they're coming from, you don't know the farm.
Right.
So I think that, just breaking the food system down to its just most fundamental level, knowing the farmer and just trying to get it so that the consumers, your neighbors are, appreciate what you're doing. I just think it has to start like in a really kind of grassroots way to make it be like, something that is achievable and desirable. The land access is a really big problem. But I think that, it's interesting that you mentioned the USDA doesn't give food subsidies, because that may be true, but just...
They don't give enough.
I
would like more of it to go to what
but like
we
big ag, like the amount of fossil fuel subsidies they are, I mean, they, help big ag so
Left and right.
disproportionately, relative to us. I mean, we barely burn any diesel fuel with our little, 1985 Kubota tractors that have 5-gallon fuel tanks. And so, I mean, I don't know to lean on that more. I think that, I'd rather push the other way and say that I think that trying to get people more comfortable with paying more for their food is important. instead of trying to have this race to the bottom where, you know, food can be as cheap as it possibly can so that farmers can then make more, you know, have the subsidy and pay their workers more. You know, I think that to have people be you know, comfortable with paying $4.50 a pound for the tomato because they know that they're helping out their neighbor who just quit their, you know, desk job because they wanted to buy 10 acres and be a farmer. That to me is like where it starts.
But just to build off there, I mean, just to riff off that, there's a profound disconnect between the cost of production and what we pay at the market. That is not a linear progression, right? I think it's really important to understand that. And when we had the inflationary period we had, there's been good documented studies that looked at if inflation was at 8%, the food prices went up 30. And that in public-facing documents that filed with FCC, the food exec was like, yeah, consumers don't know the difference between 7 and 30%, so we're going to charge whatever we can charge and see what we can get away with, right? And they did. And especially in produce, the margins tend to be 50 to 100% versus in, you know, consumer packaged goods, CPG, where you might have 2 or 3%. So the retailers, by design, are marking up to a point where that has very little relationship to the true cost of production. So it's a somewhat a false narrative that in order to do better by producers or to do better by workers that we have to pay more as a consumer. Another price point, I was talking to a grower friend of mine, and he said the gross margin between what he gets paid per pound of apple and what consumers pay for that same pound of apple ranges from retailer between 150 and 350%. 150 to 350% gross margin on the retail side, right? And so one of the frustrations I come out of organized labor is we're really good at fighting the employer, but the money is downstream, Teresa was saying. So how do we capture that margin to make sure that the farmers that they're doing right have the resources necessary and we can actually compensate workers with what they deserve?
I'd just add one thing. I mean, to be true, many, many farmers struggle to have access to land. And I think about basically periods in Black history where farmers and Black farmers had to fight tooth and nail. One, many built co-ops and cooperative models to stay afloat. Needless to say, what happens in the latter half of the 20th century is also because of USDA basically discriminatory policy. That does not help Black farmers, but every once in a while I think about these lessons that Black farmers basically leave us in this rich legacy about thinking about land access and community in different ways.
So one question I had is, where is the role of labor organizing? It used to be the thing that employers most feared, and the swelling of that membership and the way that membership enabled that union to do things that it couldn't without those members, right? UFW in the mid-70s, early 70s, they wanted to hit 100,000. They didn't quite get there. And there was even the threat of a national union. So where's the place of labor organizing today, its status, its importance to resolving this issue, and its efficacy?
Well, I would differentiate between, so in my parlance, unionization is a term of art that talks about a union trying to achieve dues-paying members, and organization, ARP organizes elders. Unfortunately, I'm now in that category now. I think organization is essential, and I think the work of migrant justice and others, the only way we're going to achieve some semblance of justice in this food system is through organizing, of which unionization is a part, worker-driven social responsibility is another part. We have an ecosystem that I think is still incomplete that will get us there. The accountability on the regulatory side, I think for the next 4 years we expect nothing, right? What we can expect, and who is highly market sensitive, which we've talked about a little bit, are the consumer-facing brands. They do not want to be associated with these horrendous conditions, and the degree to which we as consumers hold them accountable in the market with our purchasing decisions has a degree of power.
Yeah, I think, for me, we could have, this is largely focused on farm workers, and we could focus on farm workers for another 20 years. And we haven't even breached the conversation of retail workers and food service workers and, you know, chicken processing workers. And I think that where I see really exciting work happening with worker organizing is where the cross-sector organization is happening through like the Food Chain Workers Alliance and those entities that see that the challenges that farm workers have are echoed in all of these other sectors. And you know, we are actually, in some of the work that we've done recently, looking at, we're in kind of a high point for unionization, and it's happening in really unexpected places. Like this tiny little ramen shop on Church Street in Burlington is now unionized, which it kind of blows my mind. The Ben & Jerry's Scoop Shop on Church Street is now unionized. So I see there being real potential for cross-sector connections and uniting those kinds of mobilizations.
And I would like to pick up on a conversation we had at lunch. Unfortunately, Phil and Teresa were not there, but the information you shared, Erik, about the challenges of fighting the cartels at the level of recruitment in Mexico, and I'm sure elsewhere as well, once we sign on to the guest worker programs, you yourself have been combating it, and maybe you want to talk about those challenges, but also do they give you pause for, well, is this actually something that we should pursue? Because, you know, you build it and then the cartels come in and start to manage the point of entry for guest workers, right? And you're playing a game of whack-a-mole in Mexico a bit. I don't know if you want to share the whole thing, but I thought that was really interesting.
So to me, it's where you're kind of, the entry point is where you choose to engage in this food system. And for me personally, in my professional career, it has been the essential women and men who harvest food for us, period, wherever they may be in the world. And when I go into sending communities, if it's Mexico, it's Jamaica, Thailand, Vietnam, Laos, wherever it may be, people are desperate to find a way to go somewhere else. Right? And so what I like to talk about, we're in close proximity to Canada as I am in Washington State. Imagine you could gain, if you went to Canada, you could make 8 to 20 times more a day than you could right now. But the Canadians are fed up, as they are now, with us Americans, and they've built a wall. And they've militarized that wall. And someone comes to you and says, hey, you know what? For $10,000, I can sneak you in and I can get you into Canada. Right? You're underwater with your mortgage, your health insurance stinks, your kids need medical attention that you can't afford. And I especially say this to the conservative community I speak to, and I don't want an answer, what's the ethical decision? Do you stay home or do you risk everything? Right? And that is, quote unquote, the choice that many people around the world right now are making as they're trying to gain access to Europe or other countries where they can maximize the return on the day's labor. So as we listen to those voices in those communities, we felt as essential workers that are feeding us, we have a responsibility to be responsive and to figure out, is there a way to mitigate the harm that is happening? Perfection's not going to happen, right? But can we come up with a better approach that will reduce the possibility of bad things happening, right? And that's been, I think, in my experience in the labor movement, you know, the perfect's the enemy of the good. You get what you can get now, and you keep hopefully moving forward and creating progress. And I think in the world in which we find ourselves in food, this is the system that pretty much every food-producing country is now engaged in. If you go to Costa Rica and the coffee farms, it's Nicaraguan and Panamanians. If you go to Canada, it's almost 100% guest workers. I mean, pick the country, it's guest workers. And no one's figured it out. So why don't we posit that if we're going to try to make it better with farm workers who know better and see if we can come up with a better iteration of a horrendously imperfect system.
So that begins to answer what I think the last question I wanted to kind of move down the line. So a hopeful moment or aspect of where we're at that you'd like to see grow in the future. This is a kind of act of speculative fiction, if you will. So you just gave us one.
I've got a very brief one, but it's even more hopeful.
Go ahead, we'll go back to you, and then we'll come down the line.
So in the work we're doing in Semillero de Ideas, we're centering farm worker innovation, and we've sponsored 2 innovation challenges in which we invite farm workers to share with us ideas about how to address a certain issue. The first one we did was how to improve the picking of cherries. And one of the most emotional moments of my recent career is we had an award winner who came up with a better design, who won $1,000. But a woman who looked to be about my age, 58, which probably meant she was 35, came up to me in tears. And she said this was the first time in her life anybody cared about what she had to think. And I thought, oh my God, she's gone this far with nobody caring about who she is, and then thank God that we did this now, right? So that's where I find the hope of seeing people in the entirety of who they are.
So a hopeful trend.
Mine's less speculative and more realistic. So Thursday, May 1st, there's going to be lots of actions around workers' rights. In the Northeast, the Hannaford campaign to bring Hannaford into the Milk with Dignity program is very actively, there's a lot of things happening. Recently, Microjustice went to Europe and filed a human rights grievance about the supply chain that Hannaford Retail Company is involved in. There's now some work to do human rights investigations into that supply chain. And May 1st, there's lots of events locally around Hannaford to keep the pressure on to join Milk with Dignity. And I think that it's starting to hopefully become more of a reality.
All right.
Awesome. Phil.
I think it would be interesting to think. One hopeful, aspiration would be some sort of. I think that labels. I think that with the power of the consumer, I think that labels really make a difference. I think of like fair trade, for whatever that's worth, and maybe that doesn't mean much anymore. But and then the organic, organic standards and organic certification. So, I think it would be amazing if there was some sort of movement toward like a employee that would somehow demonstrate how farmers I know it sounds optimistic, but treat their employees at the most fundamental level. Or when I think about the automation and that potentially coming down the pipeline, I think that consumers would like to know if their tomato was picked by a machine that devastated a community of 50,000 people in Florida, or if it was picked on a small family farm. So if there was some way to pass that information along to the consumer to better inform their purchasing decisions, I think that would be incredible.
And Mireya, it's up to you to send us out on the hopeful note.
Oof, I don't have a lot of hope in my heart right now, but I think what the interesting work that is happening, I will echo what you said. I think the Food Chain Workers Alliance right now is thinking across areas. I'm excited about the fact that, yes, people are thinking not just about farm workers, but general ag, that this is like, that poultry workers are ag workers, that folks that raise these animals are ag workers, that all of this is one system. And so I think their analysis makes me excited. I think, I'm hoping that, there are folks right now in INS, I'm hoping, trying to push a whole lot of green cards out and, trying to make sure that folks have some kind of protection. And I think right now it's a scary time. So all I can hope is that whoever's there pushing those green cards, that they're there a little longer today and a little longer tomorrow, because I do think that is one huge equalizing factor for farm workers.
So my hope is that you'll join us for the next event, which is May 5th and 6th. It is a little bit on the down low because of the nature of it, but we're going to honor farm workers and their creativity in and around the Upper Valley, so stay tuned. You know. And then we're definitely going to honor the guest workers on Jamaican Independence Day. If you are in the Upper Valley, it will be a party and a feast not to miss. I want to thank our guest. Thank you for being here. Thank you for you.